know you saw the thumbnail, and we're going to touch on Batman, Robert Rodriguez, and even comic superstar Sean Murphy along the way. And I promise, at the end, I will give you my reasoning as to why Zorro is Batman's daddy. And it's not going to be why you think it is, but we have a ways to go before we get there. So stick around for a look at two of the best examples of the pulp legend Zorro in this episode of Graphic Adaptations. This one is complicated and needs a bunch of context, so let's do it. I think everybody knows Zorro, right? Like a twist on the classic Robin Hood type legend of a man who defends the weak from the rich and fights for what's right. He leaves his mark 3 slashes that make a Z or Z in walls and in the flesh of men. There have been plenty of novels and movies over the years that have littered the imaginations of children and grown folk alike, and there have been numerous versions in comics as well. For an episode of Graphic Adaptations, we're going to have to find a way to narrow it down, and I actually have the perfect way. So today's episode is going to cover what I think are the best 2 representations in movie and comic form for the cunning fox, Zorro. Now, recently I did a video on Django Unchained and the comic book adaptant. As an addendum to that, I also mentioned the sequel, also penned by Tarantino, which also happens to be a crossover with Zorro, written by Matt Wagner. As mentioned in that video, Wagner had already been writing a really great series for Zorro, and while in that video I just took a quick look and mention of that series, today I want to talk a little bit more about it and just why it's so special, if we could. As I mentioned, Zorro's another Robin Hood character, but he's also something of a precursor to Batman, many times being the actual inspiration for Bruce Wayne in continuity. In some stories, his parents are murdered in Crime Alley right after they come out of a movie theater where they saw Zorro together. Sometimes it's the 1920s version of Mark of Zorro, and sometimes it's the 1940s version. But this is not the main reason that Zorro is Batman's daddy, by the way. I'm going to return to this at the end, but that's not the reason. It's not the in-continuity reason. Zorro himself is a product of the pulps, the first story for whom was published in 1919 in 5 parts, and within a year the silent movie version of The Mark of Zorro was a film which fed the appetite for readers to read the original story, which then got republished as a novel, and many more novels followed, but interestingly, none give him like a fully fleshed out or definitive origin. Well, long after the original writer, Johnson McCulley, passed away, a Chilean author, Isabel Allende, writes a novel which is published in Spanish in 2005, which gives us that definitive origin. It's faithful to the canon already established, but it goes into far more detail, specifically the formative teen years. In 2008, Dynamite begins a monthly Zorro comic book written by Matt Wagner, adapting the Isabel Allende novel, while also making some edits to her plot. And this is the book that I want to highlight here. It might be out of print, but I think it's worth seeking out. Now, I'm not usually the biggest fan of origin stories, especially if we already know the lore. Like, nobody wants to see another Bruce Wayne in the alley with the pearls again. And especially if you have nothing new to offer, right? Anyway, and that's where this version gets interesting. The narrative throughout the comic is intercutting between a present-time Zorro and then flashbacks to his youth as Diego de la Vega, until we catch up to the present-day Zorro, and the adventures are generous. We get to see all the formative life lessons that would forge the man that Zorro becomes. He sees the cruelty and injustice that citizens face at the hand of their brutal authority figures, the vast disparity between the wealthy and the poor. We see his connection to the Aboriginal Indian tribes and his spirit animal, the fox. Zorro is Spanish for fox, which is why that part was relevant. His connection to them is through his best friend Bernardo, who is something of a Tonto or an Alfred Pennyworth or a John Watson type, like a sidekick, like a partner. He's the narrator for our story, and we get to see the transformation into Zorro through his eyes. When their mothers are both murdered in front of them at a young age, Bernardo becomes mute from the trauma, and then shortly thereafter the boys are shipped off to Spain for school. While there, Diego learns to master the sword from his teacher Escalante, who is also in a revolutionary secret brotherhood and who inducts Diego, who picks the name Zorro as his codename. La Justicia's members have all animal codenames and dedicate themselves to, and I quote, "justice for people who are marginalized in society," end quote. That sounds pretty great, right? Something that's always needed. This is a really great way of combining all of his experiences to really show how Diego becomes Zorro at each step. Think of it as like Batman Begins. It's the entire blueprint for the character. He gets his swordplay from Escalante, who helps him hone his politics and how to operate in the shadows, and his codename. And when he returns home, he, like Batman, adopts a persona of a spoiled rich kid to throw off any suspicion that he could possibly be El Zorro. Even to his father's face, to like sell the illusion, which is just crushing to see. The artwork throughout this first volume is by Francesco Francavilla, perhaps best known for Afterlife of Archie. I don't know, he's done so much work. Feel free to post your favorite Francavilla work in the comments. So the art is top notch, and Wagner's writing, reinterpreting Allende's novel, is pitch perfect in my opinion. Now, while I haven't read the actual novel, I understand there are entire subplots that were dropped for the comic, mostly the romantic angles that weave throughout the story, but also extra swashbuckling adventures, like when Escalante is accused of being a revolutionary and is arrested, and Diego convinces the rest of La Justicia to help rescue him. Some of that excise material might be explored in the subsequent volumes in graphic novels, like, for example, his romance is covered in Volume 2, and it seems like it's very close to the tone of the Allende material, but without having read the novel, I couldn't say for sure. I'm just reading synopsis online. There's also a third volume in this initial series, but then Wagner comes back to do another run of Zorro, which focuses on his relationship with his father, who believes his son to be a spoiled rich brat, and then he finds out the truth, and it's a really touching story. And these two books also build two characters of note: El Galgo, the Hound, who's a soldier driven insane by his many defeats at the hands of Zorro. His body had numerous Zs carved into him already, but now he does it himself, and his insanity has like sharpened his ferocity to make him a more formidable and unpredictable nemesis. And the other character is Lady Zorro, a woman who's inspired by Zorro but driven by bloodlust and vengeance, and who murders, something that Zorro doesn't do. That's just a brief rundown of these comics, but I wanted to highlight a couple other volumes. As I mentioned, Wagner also teamed up with Tarantino to write a crossover sequel to Django, which is really great, and if you want to know more about that, I've already got a video up on the channel now that you can check out, but there are also a couple other volumes that stand out that came out more recently. American Mythology published a mini-series called Zorro Swords from Hell, about Zorro as hell comes to earth and monsters and demons walk among us, and it's pretty fun. Exactly what you'd expect. And the other is a more recently, published in 2023, Man of the Dead, is a Zorro adventure written by Sean Murphy of Batman White Knight fame, or his cyberpunk comic Tokyo Ghost. Told you we'd come to Sean Murphy at some point. This is a fun look at Zorro in a more contemporary time with cars and phones. The idea that Zorro is the legend we all know, but this Diego de la Vega sees his parents die at the hands of gangsters, and it causes a kind of mental break where he believes he actually is Zorro. So a sort of Mexican action crime genre, and if it were a movie, I'd say it was directed by Robert Rodriguez. And I doubt that was far from Sean Murphy's mind when he made it. From the Mexican standoffs to a badass gangster named Trejo, and look at this dude. This book is really great. I really enjoyed it, and it kind of reads like, what if Robert Rodriguez had directed a Zorro movie? And as we now move over to the movie side of this episode, let's remember this Robert Rodriguez connection. Now for the movie portion, I'm choosing the 1998 Antonio Banderas movie, The Mask of Zorro, even though technically we could probably use any Zorro movie from the 20s or 40s as the source material. The novel by Allende, that the Wagner comic was based on, aside from coalescing the elements of Zorro from over the decades of different interpretations, also borrowed elements from the 1998 Mask of Zorro movie quite specifically, and I kind of find that fascinating, right? The way that the mythology of a character like Zorro gathers these threads separately as it goes through pop culture, adding to itself, and I'm sure that we haven't seen the end of this process of refinement, but for the purposes of this video, I think that the Antonio Banderas Catherine Zeta-Jones movie is nicely tied to this comic book and the novel it's based on, because elements from that movie clearly found their way into the novel 8 years later. It's like a Zorro pretzel. Specifically, the training sequences with Escalante and his training circles feel like a direct homage, and having that elder statesman character like Anthony Hopkins in the movie. The Mask of Zorro was a box office smash, and I think it was riding the Hollywood trend for the time, remaking these big literary adventure classics like Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves from 1991 or The Three Musketeers in 1993 that preceded Zorro. The movie was helmed by director Martin Campbell, who has a pretty interesting filmography, honestly. Incredibly high highs, shocking low lows. He makes inarguably two of the very best James Bond films, right? GoldenEye and Casino Royale. Plus, he makes these two Zorro movies, and then also Green Lantern. Also Green Lantern. How is that even possible? That just doesn't add up. So Campbell was fresh off of GoldenEye when he signed on board. Banderas and Hopkins were already on board, but there's this like nasty little bit of Hollywood doing a racism that happens right before that. See, Banderas is only Zorro because he was just in Desperado, directed by Robert Rodriguez. See, I told you we were coming back to that, okay? So Amblin and Steven Spielberg were interested in the duo of Banderas and Rodriguez to make this film, especially because they liked how Rodriguez could make a small budget look bigger the way he films, using all kinds of ingenious exploitation film tricks. Banderas' star was on the rise in no small part because of Desperado, and so this was a great package, except they wanted Rodriguez to make the movie for less. Now, Rodriguez finally leaves the project over the budget, asking for $42 million, and the studio wouldn't budge over $41 million. They really didn't want to go past $35 million, they said. And that's all fine, except when you figure that they wanted a big budget when it was the previous director, and when Martin Campbell was signed on, the budget was $60 million, and eventually ballooned up to $95 million. I mean, come on. Now, maybe that wasn't intentional to give the brown guy half of what the other directors get, and specifically because he works harder and smarter so that they can get more out of him, but it's not a good look. And this sort of makes me wonder if Sean Murphy was just dying to see what a Rodriguez Zorro movie could have looked like. Me too, actually. In fact, another weird little possible bigotry is in the casting of Catherine Zeta-Jones, and I have no proof here, this is pure conjecture, but I'm supposed to believe that they wanted Rodriguez and Banderas from Desperado, but not Salma Hayek, even though there was a character right there for her. Well, I guess if there was another Latina actress that was more talented... Oh, they just cast a white woman. Yeah. So now, Campbell's on board with Banderas, Hopkins, and Catherine Zeta-Jones, and the movie comes out and it's a big smash hit. Critical and box office success. It's both a perfect tribute to the mythology of Zorro and also a more complicated, albeit condensed version of the original story in a sequel form. Rather than simply attempting a basic remake or reboot, here Hopkins plays an aging Zorro who trains a common street criminal to become the next Zorro. And in this way, they cleverly retain all of the canon, while at the same time giving the audience a new jumping on point. I love stuff like this. It shows love and respect, as well as creative ingenuity. And in this way, older fans had their Zorro preserved, and now new fans had this jumping on point for a new Zorro. I don't think I really need to go into all the details of a Hollywood blockbuster that I think most people would have seen, but I do want to mention one other plot-related aspect that you might not know. Did you know that much of the plot is actually taken or borrowed from another literary and cinematic classic, The Count of Monte Cristo? So this is a novel by Alexandre Dumas, who wrote The Three Musketeers, and it's about a guy whose rival for his fiancée decides to take him out of the equation and has him falsely imprisoned for years, where he meets a fellow prisoner who teaches him many things and helps him escape and encourages him to take his own hidden fortune and go back to the city reinvented as a nobleman to exact his revenge. There is So much of that in Mask of Zorro. Hopkins is separated not from his fiancée, but from his infant daughter, and imprisoned by his rival and left to rot. And he does escape eventually. Now, he becomes the fellow prisoner to Banderas, who in turn learns all this stuff from the old Zorro, how to fight, how to conduct himself in aristocratic upper-class society, and they also craft a false persona in order to get close to the man responsible for their suffering to exact revenge. It's really such a perfect fit for Zorro, but also interesting that the Count of Monte Cristo was also a predecessor to Zorro, possibly an inspiration as well, and for Batman, who also borrows the trope of leaving to get trained and then coming back with a playboy persona to cover for his clandestine crime fighting. That's still not why Zorro is Batman's daddy, okay? We're almost there, just hang on. There's so much to find appealing about The Legend of Zorro. Not specifically the movie sequel that was made like 7 years later, The Legend of Zorro, but the actual Legend of Zorro. From the costume and the mask, the flair for the dramatic, the high adventures, acrobatics, and swordplay, but I think what I find most appealing is the class warfare. Zorro fights the wealthy. He fights landowners and the authorities. He fights for the poor and indigenous people. His function, or mission, is to right injustice. And I don't think it's coincidence that an author like Isabel Allende, with her background, would find Zorro fertile ground to lend her voice to. She was a practicing feminist. She was exiled from her country after the Pinochet coup in the 1970s. Her cousin, Salvador Allende, a socialist leader, committed suicide as a result of the US-backed intervention into his democratically elected reign, and was followed by a decade of brutal fascist authoritarian rule that disappeared thousands of people. With a background based on those politics and experiences, it isn't hard to see how Allende found a connection to Zorro. And this is why Zorro is Batman's daddy. I mean, obviously the Batcave is taken from Zorro, and the Batmobile is an updated version of Zorro's Black Horse Tornado. So much of Zorro's creative DNA exists in Batman, but at the core of the character, the one thing that makes Zorro tower over Batman is the class consciousness. Sure, Batman wants justice, and he fights big-moneyed villains like Lex Luthor, but Batman's aims are often childish in their thoughts. He needs to control everything. He puts on a suit and uses his money to buy his own toys and gadgets to help him beat up individuals who largely have mental health issues. And I've heard all the arguments against this, that people with mental health who kill people or are terrorists don't have an excuse, and I don't think they do either, but I think that misses the point. I mean, we can all agree that a mentally unwell person in a bat suit operating outside the law is equally as disturbing as his rogues gallery. The big problem here is how he isn't really solving anything. Gotham is the worst for crime. Arkham doesn't contain these people or heal them. Think of what Batman could do or has done, sitting in the Mobius chair, his extreme intellect, the power he wields, and the friends he has, and the wealth he has. But nor he or Bruce Wayne with Elon Musk-type monies will solve homelessness. He won't solve systemic problems. He wants to be in the streets doing violence, and he really stands to uphold the current power structure. He protects the rich healthcare CEOs as much as the people being screwed over by them, forced to watch their loved ones die. His war against crime is the logic of a small child with trauma wanting to punch a bad guy to fix a problem. And the problem with that is that he never seems to fix anything and spends his wealth not addressing the main cause of pain for the majority of people in his city. Why doesn't he fund a better Arkham to actually get these people the help they need, or enough security to make sure they stop escaping? The focus isn't often on healing and is more on fighting. Batman stories are usually about big cosmic events or crime sprees by colorful, crazy characters, but Zorro's capers are all motivated by a class injustice, helping the poorest people being taken advantage by the wealthiest. And Robin Hood did it too. Batman is teen angst wish fulfillment. His rogues gallery don't really exist to us readers, but the injustice in our world is very real. Two-Face, the Joker, the Riddler, oftentimes they personify a part of Batman, or a dark reflection of himself, but rarely does Batman tackle issues on a systemic level. instead training us to think of the individual over the collective. He's the ultimate bootstraps character, and everything about his fight is fantastical and self-centered. Meanwhile, Zorro fights the powers that makes the lives of everyday individuals worse. Batman lost a step in there, I think. Or maybe it's more interesting to say that we as a society have. If this is how we've evolved our vision of a hero, from a freedom fighter for the vulnerable and hungry to a billionaire edgelord fantasy who maintains the status quo, I mean, where do we go wrong? Zorro's about class consciousness and justice for teeming masses of people, while Batman is focused on his own personal suffering. Zorro redistributes wealth, liberating out-of-control taxes on situations where those taxes aren't even going to public utilities. Zorro recognizes white-collar crime. While it's highly dubious that a massive corporation like Wayne Enterprises could be profitable or competitive without cutting all the same corners that real-world corporations do. And the people celebrate Zorro. But often in Batman stories, he's feared. That, in my opinion, is why Zorro will always be Batman's daddy. Do you really think that Wayne Enterprises could be so rich and pay their fair share of taxes? You think that Bruce Wayne could afford Batwings and secret satellites if he was paying all of his employees a living wage? You think Batman pays his taxes? I'll see you guys next week. Somebody's going to point out in the comments which Batman comics address all of my criticisms. Just know it.